Welcome to Restoria. I'm Arthur, and this is your quiet place for gentle bedtime stories. Get comfortable, take a breath, and let the story slow your thoughts and ease you softly into sleep. The Greenhouse in Winter. Wren walked down the path through the frozen garden as the afternoon was beginning to turn toward evening. The path had been swept clear of the morning's snow, which lay now in pale drifts along its edges, the kind of drifts that hold their shape until something disturbs them, and then collapse with a hush. Beyond the drifts, the garden was a grey-white country, the bare branches of the apple trees rimmed with frost, the dark line of the yew hedge under its load of snow, the few late stalks of last year's perennials standing like brown candles in the open beds. The garden was sleeping. It would sleep for some months yet. Wren did not mind. She had come to like the garden in this sleeping season almost as much as she liked it in its waking one. The path she walked had been laid by her grandfather more than half a lifetime ago, in flat stones the color of old butter. The stones had settled with the years into the give of the earth beneath them, and now they lay in their uneven row, each one slightly different from its neighbors, each one knowing the weight of 1,000 walkings of the same walk. Wren had come to love the uneven feel of them under her boots in winter, when the cold made her aware of the ground in a way the heat of summer sometimes did not. Each stone met her boot with its own response. Each carried her one step further down toward the greenhouse at the end. The kitchen garden lay to her right as she walked, its old box hedge low under its dusting of snow. Inside the box, the rows of last summer's vegetables had been cleared months ago, the beds turned and rested, and now they lay in their brown rest under the white. A robin lifted from the top of the hedge as she passed, with the thin note that robins make in winter, and dropped down again into the next bay of the hedge a few paces along. The robin watched her without watching, in the alert way of robins, and Wren walked on past without meeting his eye, in the careful way that people who live alongside wild creatures learn over time. At the end of the path, where it bent slightly to the left, along an old box hedge, the greenhouse stood in its shape. An old Victorian thing of cast iron and many panes of glass, set against the south-facing wall of the kitchen garden, with its low roof rising to a peak and the snow lying in uneven drifts across the upper panes. The glass was clouded inside, milky with the heat of the air on the other side meeting the cold of the air on this one, and the heat showed through as a yellowing where the lamps within were already lit. A thin, pale curl of smoke rose from the chimney at the far end, the chimney of the wood stove she would have lit at noon and stoked once more at 3. The smoke went straight up in the windless air and disappeared into the low, grey sky. To one side of the greenhouse stood the old apple trees in their winter shapes, their bare branches lifted into the cold air like the careful fingers of a hand at rest. Her grandfather had planted them, one a year, across 5 years of his early married life, and they had grown across the decades into the shapes their pruning had taught them. In the heat of summer, they bore the kind of green-streaked English apples that no shop wanted anymore, and she gathered them each autumn into baskets and pressed half of them into juice and gave the other half away in the village. Tonight they stood empty of fruit and empty of leaf, holding only their snow, the snow lying along the upper sides of each branch in thin white seams. They were waiting too. The trees in the garden and the greenhouse were all waiting together in the way a household waits for a thing it has learned how to wait for. Wren walked the last of the path. Her boots gave a squeak on the swept stones beneath her. Her breath rose in white plumes. The cold air on her cheeks had gone past biting into something steadier, the kind of cold that settles into a person who has been in it long enough that her body has made its own adjustments. She reached the green-painted door at the near end of the greenhouse. The brass handle was cold under her gloved hand. She turned it. The door opened with a hush of well-fitted wood meeting well-fitted wood. The heat met her at the threshold. A thick heat, the kind that has been gathering in a closed glass space all afternoon, full of damp earth and growing leaves and the cedary smell of the wood stove at the far end. Wren stepped through. She slid the door closed behind her. The latch clicked into its brass keeper. The cold of the garden was on the other side of the glass now. She had crossed into the green room. The greenhouse always felt to Wren like a hidden country. The glass walls and the roof above made it a single room set apart from the world, a room with its own weather, its own population, its own calendar of work. The world outside the glass might be wet, or cold, or windswept, or snow-blanketed, but inside the glass, the air was always the same green air, the temperature held by the wood stove at the far end, the humidity gathered by the breath of the plants in their rows. She had spent a great many evenings of her life inside this hidden country. She had learned its daily ways, its weekly ways, its monthly and yearly ways. She had become, across the years, the keeper of its seasons. Her grandmother had been the keeper before her great-grandmother before that. Her greenhouse had been built in the 1880s, in the careful style of the time, by a man who was no relation, but who had worked for her great-grandmother's family in his youth. His name was carved into the inside of one of the iron crossbeams in careful letters, where Wren had first seen it as a child standing on a bench beside her grandmother, who had pointed it out. John Marsh, the carving said, with a date below, 1887. He had built the greenhouse and gone on his way long before any of them were born. The greenhouse remained. The keepers had come and gone. The greenhouse remained. She stood a moment just inside the door, breathing in. The damp air came in, and her cold lungs accepted it gratefully, and a fog of breath came out and dissolved at once into the heat. Her glasses, which she was wearing still, fogged over in an even film. She lifted them from her face, breathed once on each lens, and wiped them clean with the corner of her wool scarf. When she put them back on, the greenhouse came back into focus around her. The greenhouse was a long room, 20 paces from end to end, with a central path of old red brick running its length. On either side of the path, the staging stood waist-high, wide wooden benches with their fronts a worn green, and on the staging, the plants sat in their rows, each one in its terracotta pot, each pot resting on a layer of fine dark gravel that held the moisture. The geraniums, dormant now but leafed, their papery leaves a grey-green. The pelargoniums, scented kinds, the rose leaf and the lemon and the dusty green nutmeg, all of them resting through the winter months without making any fuss. The fuchsias cut back hard, their dark stems bare except where a few leaf buds had begun to think about pushing. The cyclamen in flower, their pale pink and deep pink upturned blooms standing in clusters on the staging at the heated end. The two old camellia bushes at the very far end, their dark glossy leaves an almost black green, the first of their winter buds hard and showing. She walked along the brick path. The bricks were warm beneath the soles of her boots, the heat of the wood stove having settled into them over the afternoon. The air around her was thick with the damp heat of the place, and the smell of it was the kind that gathers in a working greenhouse over many decades. Damp earth, old terracotta, the bitterness of pelargonium leaves brushed in passing, the sweetness of the cyclamen flowers, the cedary breath of the wood stove at the far end. She breathed it all in, and her shoulders, which had been holding the held shape of someone who had walked through the cold, began to drop. She walked the length of the path once before doing anything. This was her habit. Her grandmother had walked the path the same way, all those years ago, in the same looking walk that was less work than ritual. Her mother had done it the same way. The looking walk was how the keeper of the greenhouse said good evening to the room before she began the careful tasks of the night. The first walk was a looking walk, where she did not stop to do any task but only let her eyes pass along the rows, taking the sense of how the plants were holding up against the cold. Most of them were holding up well. The geraniums had their papery look but no signs of trouble. The pelargoniums were steady. The fuchsias showed their first buds in the way she had hoped. The cyclamen were in their rolling bloom. Only one pot near the middle of the right-hand staging had a single yellow leaf hanging from a stem that should have been all green. She would come back to that one in a moment. She kept walking. The heat was working into her now, through the wool of her sleeves and the cotton of her shirt and the bones of her hands. Her cheeks, which had been cold from the path, were beginning to feel the heat too. A prickle of returning warmth ran along the line of her brow and down to her chin. She breathed in. The greenhouse air entered her in its full damp greenness and stayed in her a while, and went out into the room and was taken back. The breathing was good. The breathing was the first good thing of the evening's work. The lamps on the cross beams above her made faint humming sounds, where the brass of their shades expanded in the heat. The condensation on the inside of the glass roof gathered into drops along the iron beams. A drop fell somewhere along the brick path with a kind sound. Wren walked past the rows of pelargoniums and let her left hand brush the very tip of one rose leaf as she passed. The lemony resistance of the leaf came up under her fingertip, and the clean smell rose up from where her finger had touched, and she walked on with the smell going with her. Halfway along the path, she stopped at the staging on her left to look at a pot of jasmine that had been resting through the winter. Its stems were bare and brown, except where new buds were beginning to show along the upper canes. She had seen these first buds a week ago. They were a little larger now. The jasmine was beginning, in its careful way, to think about the spring that was some weeks off yet. She liked that the jasmine was already thinking. She let the thought of the jasmine's thinking be a thing she carried in her own mind and walked on. At the far end of the path, she stopped at the wood stove. A black iron stove, no larger than a kitchen kettle on a stand, with its round door and its round chimney. She crouched in front of it, opened the door with her gloved hand, and looked in. A bed of red coals, glowing where one half-burned log lay across them. She took a fresh log from the basket beside the stove and set it carefully on top of the half-burned one. She closed the door. The stove gave a low whump as the new log caught, and a brighter, brief glow showed through the mica window in the door. The stove had been her mother's choice many years ago, when the old paraffin heater that her grandmother had used had finally given up, and a new source of heat had needed to be found. The stove was a black thing of plain iron, the kind that English country greenhouses had been heated by for 100 years before paraffin came along, and 100 years before electricity, and 100 years before whatever came next. The stove did not need very much wood. A log every few hours through the cold months was enough to keep the green air at its set temperature. Wren had grown to love it for its hush, its size, its faithful burn through the winter evenings. The stove asked little: a log every few hours, a careful clearing of its ashtray once a week, a sweep of its chimney once a year. The stove gave back heat in steady measure and asked only these few things in return. She fed it the way her mother had fed it, with the same logs from the same low basket, and the stove gave back its heat in the same careful way. The log basket was nearly full. She had filled it that morning from the woodshed at the end of the kitchen garden, in 3 trips down the path with her wheelbarrow. The morning had been clear and cold then, and the path stones had glittered under their morning frost, and the trips had been the good work of a winter morning. She remembered the trips now without quite meaning to remember them. They had become part of the day's shape, the way the good works of a familiar life become part of its shape. The wheelbarrow lived under a sheet of old tarpaulin against the back wall of the woodshed when it was not in use, and she pulled it out each morning before breakfast in the cold months and rolled it down to the greenhouse along the swept stones. It was older than she was. Her grandfather had bought it the year before she was born, in a hardware shop 2 villages over that did not exist anymore, and across the years it had hauled apples in autumn and brought logs in winter, and carried the cuttings from the kitchen garden in spring and summer. The handles had been wrapped many times in twine where the original wood had worn through. The wheels sang a little when she pushed it on a cold morning, the way old wheels sing when their bearings have not yet loosened up with use. She had grown to like the singing. It was the wheelbarrow's way of saying it was alive enough to keep going. A brass watering can lived on the floor at the head of the brick path, just inside the door. Old, of the kind with a tall, narrow neck that gardeners had used for 100 years, with a rose at the end of the spout for the misting of seedlings in spring. Winter the can rested empty, its brass clouded over with age and use, waiting for the lighter work of March. She did not need to water tonight. She had watered yesterday morning, in a careful round with the can 2/3 full, and the soil in the pots was holding the moisture as it should. The can sat where it sat, waiting for tomorrow or the day after, the way old gardening tools wait between their seasons. Wren had picked it up out of habit on her first walk along the path, as she always did on entering, and had felt the dry weight of an empty can in her hand and set it down again. The dry weight of the empty can was its winter weight. The can would gather to itself a different weight in another month. She straightened. Her knees these days did not enjoy the crouching, but they accepted it without too much complaint, the way old knees accept the asks of familiar work. She unwound her scarf from her neck and laid it over the back of the wooden chair that stood beside the stove. She unbuttoned her coat and hung it on the hook on the wall above the chair. She slipped off her gloves and tucked them into the coat's pocket. Now she was a leaner shape, in her old grey wool jumper and her dark working trousers and her knitted cap, ready for the work of the evening. She walked back along the brick path, this time stopping where things needed her. The pot with the single yellow leaf first. She bent close. The plant was a pelargonium, the rose leaf kind, and the yellow leaf was at the end of its life, the way leaves come to the end of their lives, particularly in winter when growth is slow and old leaves give themselves up to make room for new. She pinched the leaf at its stem with the careful pinch of fingers that have done this work many thousand times, and the leaf came away cleanly. She laid it in the wooden bowl that lived on the staging for exactly this purpose. The bowl was already a quarter full of papery brown things, the fall of the winter leaves she had pinched and gathered across the past few weeks. She moved on, pausing here and there to lay a fingertip on a leaf and feel the resistance of it, the way one tests a sleeping animal's coat to be sure it is breathing well. Each leaf gave its response. Each plant said the thing it needed to say. Most said nothing. Most said only that they were going on with their winter sleep at the right pace. Most a fuchsia stake had loosened in its pot. She pressed it back into the soil and tied a length of green twine around the stem and the stake to hold them together. A cyclamen leaf had a faint silver dusting that she did not like the look of. She did not do anything about it tonight. She made a note in the careful place in her mind where such notes lived that she would come back to it in the morning with a dish of the powder she kept on the high shelf for exactly this kind of dusting. Tomorrow's task. Not tonight's. Not tonight's. Not tonight's. She had come to like the marks she made in her mind for tomorrow's tasks. They were careful promises she made to the plants. A little powder for the cyclamen with the silver dust. A little fresh gravel for the pot whose surface had thinned. A little string for the stem that was leaning. The plants did not need to know. The plants only needed her to come back tomorrow and to remember and to do the thing that needed doing. The remembering was its own careful work, and Wren had grown to like it as much as the doing. When she reached the heated end of the greenhouse where the cyclamen were in their rolling bloom, she paused and looked at them for a while. Their pale pink and deep pink flowers stood in their clusters on the staging, each flower a single upturned petal cluster on a slender stem. The leaves were dark green with silver markings in their rounded shapes. She had grown these particular cyclamen from corms her mother had given her many years ago in a brown paper bag, and the corms had multiplied across the years, and now they sat in their terracotta pots on the staging at the heated end of the greenhouse, blooming through the cold months in the way of cyclamen. Cyclamen were the kind of plant that asked little and gave much. They wanted only a cool, dry rest in their summer dormancy, a careful waking in the autumn, and a steady winter light to push their flowers up through. Wren had given them those things faithfully across the years, and they had given her these rolling blooms in return, evening by evening, January by January, through all the cold months of all the years. Wren laid a finger on the rim of one of the pots. The terracotta was warm. The soil beneath the surface gravel was the right kind of damp. She moved her hand to the next pot and the next, checking each one in this light way that was almost not work at all. The pots were all warm. The soil was all right. The cyclamen were doing what they did. She straightened and walked back along the staging on the right side, then around the head of the path, then back along the staging on the left side. Each plant got a look, a touch, an acknowledgement. One of the cyclamen, on the third pot from the left, had a flower the colour of a thrush's breast, a particular pink that her daughter had loved as a child, and that Wren had grown for her every winter since the daughter had moved away. The daughter would come for a few days at Christmas most years, and would walk down through the snow on the path with Wren, and would stand at this exact spot on the staging looking at this exact pot, and would say every time that the thrush breast pink was the loveliest of all of them. Wren agreed with her. The thrush breast pink was the loveliest. She had not told her daughter that the corm in this pot had come from a piece broken off the original corm her own mother had given her, which made this particular plant a part of the daughter's grandmother as much as a part of her mother and herself. She would tell her at Christmas, perhaps, this year. Or perhaps not. Some things did not need telling, only growing. When she had finished her rounds, she came back to the wooden chair by the wood stove and sat down. Her body welcomed the chair the way a body welcomes a chair after a careful round of standing tasks. The curved wooden back received the give of her shoulders. The rush seat received the give of her hips. The chair gave its old creak, the kind of creak that an old kitchen chair gives when a familiar weight settles into it. Wren let herself be received. The chair was an old kitchen chair, the kind with a curved back and a worn rush seat, that had lived in the greenhouse since Wren had become its keeper. A thermos of tea sat on the staging beside the chair where she had left it earlier. The thermos was the same one her mother had used, and her grandmother before that, a thick, squat thing of dark green metal with a worn brass band around its middle. The thermos had been refilled at this kitchen sink at this hour for as many years as anyone in the family could remember. It had a cork stopper, and the tea inside had been hot when she filled it at the kitchen sink at 3. She unscrewed the cup from its top, opened the cork, and poured. Steam rose from the cup at once into the damp air, climbing toward the higher panes of the glass roof. The smell of the tea came up to her, earthy, the kind of black tea she always drank at this hour, with a splash of milk that had been added before the thermos was sealed. She held the cup in both hands a moment, feeling its heat on her palms, and then she sipped. The tea was hot. The cup was an old one, with a brown stain along its inner rim from 1,000 cups of tea. She had grown to like the stain. It was the cup's honest record of its use, and she would never have wanted to scrub it clean. Not as hot as when first poured at the kitchen, but holding its heat, the way old thermoses keep tea hot if their corks are good and their seals are sound. She sat with the cup in her hands and looked along the length of the greenhouse. The brick path stretched away from her in its line. The plants stood in their rows on either side. The two lamps hanging from the crossbeams of the iron roof threw their yellow circles down onto the staging, and where the circles met the greens and grey-greens of the leaves caught the light in careful ways. Above the lamps, the glass roof was hidden in part by the snow that had drifted across it through the day, and where the snow lay thicker, the roof was a grey-white, and where the snow had not gathered, the roof was a darker grey-blue where the evening sky showed through. She had known this rhythm for many years. The same chair, the same thermos, the same round, the same thoughts, the same wood stove ticking at her side. The greenhouse evening had its own liturgy, and she had become its keeper, evening by evening, year by year. The liturgy was not work, it was how the evening went. The wood stove beside her gave it sounds of a fire settled into its evening burn. A tick of expanding iron, a hush of combustion, the faint occasional pop of a knot in the wood as the flames found it. Wren listened to these sounds with the careful attention of a person who has spent a great many evenings in their company. Each sound said something ordinary about the fire's work. Each said that the fire was well, that the wood was burning at the right rate, that the heat would hold for some hours yet without further attention. The greenhouse always taught her, in its way, the difference between work that asks attention and work that does not. The wood stove now was the second kind. It needed nothing more from her tonight. The plants were the same. She had walked her rounds. She had pinched her one yellow leaf. She had retied her one fuchsia stake. She had made her careful note about the cyclamen. The work that needed her tonight had been done, and the work that did not need her had been left to do its own business in its own time. Now she could simply sit. The sitting was the third kind of work, and it was, perhaps, the kind she liked best. Through the glass she could hear faintly the wind that had begun to move along the upper hedge of the garden in the last half hour. It was a thin wind, the kind that comes off the fields after sundown in winter and runs along the tops of hedges before slipping away. It made a careful sound against the panes of the greenhouse roof, a hush at the edges where the seams between the panes met the iron. Somewhere in the village across the field, the church clock chimed the half hour, faintly, as if from far off. Wren heard the chime without counting. She did not need to know which half hour it was. She had stopped needing to know which half hour it was many winters ago. She drank the tea. The cup grew lighter in her hands. The heat of the tea worked its way down her throat, into her chest, where it met the heat of the greenhouse air, and the two heats pooled together in the space behind her sternum and made a careful comfort there. Her shoulders, which had begun to drop on the first walk along the path, dropped a little further now. Her hands, around the cup, eased their grip. Her feet, in their boots, pressed down on the brick of the floor. The smell of the greenhouse air, now that she was not moving through it, seemed to grow a little richer around her. The damp earth smell from the staging, the bitterness of pelargonium leaves, the sweetness of the cyclamen at the heated end. the cedar of the wood stove. All of these mingled in the damp air around her chair, and she breathed them in, and they settled into her with each breath. She had read once that the smell of soil contained a kindness for the human body, that the act of breathing greenhouse air was, for a person who needed easing after a cold day, the kind of unspoken treatment that the body's older wisdom recognized at once. She believed it. Her body always recognized it. Her shoulders always dropped. Her hands always grew warm. Her chest always eased in the place where it sometimes carried the tightness of a long day. The light beyond the glass had gone from the afternoon grey to the darker grey of early evening. Where the snow lay thinner on the upper panes, the deepening sky showed through in blues. The snow had built up across the afternoon in uneven drifts. Some of the drifts had grown thick enough to cast shadows on the inside of the glass below them, the panes there a deeper grey-white than the panes around. Where the iron crossbeams ran beneath the glass, the snow above had melted in lines along the heated metal, leaving clear strips of pane through which the dusk sky now showed in narrow blue ribbons. Wren liked these ribbons. She had watched the same ribbons appear, evening by evening, every winter of her life of keeping the greenhouse, and she had grown fond of them in the way one grows fond of things one has watched a great many times. A few dark shapes moved past the upper panes now and then, late birds returning to wherever they roosted for the night, and once a single magpie landed on the snowy ridge of the greenhouse roof, walked along the ridge for a few paces with its careful steps, and lifted off again into the dusk. Wren watched the magpie's shadow pass across the lit interior of the greenhouse without making anything of it. The two evenings were happening side by side, separated only by the thickness of the snowy roof, and Wren liked that arrangement. The magpie had found its heat in some sheltered eave of the old stable across the garden, perhaps. She had her own heat here, beside the wood stove. Two pockets of heat, side by side, holding their places in the winter evening. She finished the cup of tea and poured a second, more carefully this time. The thermos gave its glug as the level inside dropped. She set the thermos back on the staging beside her, the cork stopper laid carefully on top, and held the second cup in both hands without drinking it. Let it heat her palms. Let the steam rise into the lamplight in its lazy curls. She thought in the way she thought when the greenhouse had taken her into its evening hold, of the line of evenings she had spent in this room. Some of them with her mother, who had taught her this work, on winter evenings very much like this one, when the snow had lain on the roof and the wood stove had ticked at the far end and the cyclamen had bloomed in their rows. Some of them with her own daughter, when the daughter had been a child and had liked to come down to the greenhouse with her in the cold evenings and trace patterns in the steam of the glass with one careful finger. Some of them by herself, in the widening hours that came when the daughter had grown up and gone away and the mother had grown old and gone elsewhere too. All of these evenings had been their own. All of them had also been the same evening. The greenhouse held them all, in its way, in the green hold of its life. She thought of her mother in particular for a moment, the thought rising up of its own accord. Her mother had taught her this work in the careful way her mother had taught her most things, by walking the path beside her and pointing to one plant after another and saying the name. Pelargonium, cyclamen, camellia. The names had felt large in her child mouth at first, and easy enough by 12, and now, after so many years of saying them under her breath as she walked the rows, the names sat in her mouth as comfortably as the names of cousins. Her mother had a good voice for plant names. Wren heard her mother's voice in her own when she said them, sometimes in the way of a daughter carrying a mother forward through the kept work of the years. She sipped the second cup of tea. The thought sat with her a while, and then it slipped away. She did not need it. She had only needed it to come up briefly in the drifting way it had, and to settle her further into the evening she was in. The greenhouse air was thick around her shoulders. The glass walls held the heat in. The snow on the roof kept the cold above her at its careful distance. The wood stove made its sounds. The lamps held their yellow circles on the staging. The plants in their rows made no sound at all, in the way plants do not make sound, and yet the room was full of them, and the room did not feel lonely, only full, the way a room feels full when many companions are sharing it without speaking. She drank her tea. The cup grew lighter again. The wood stove ticked. The cyclamen held their pink. The pelargoniums held their grey-green. A drop of moisture released itself from one of the upper panes of the glass roof and fell with a sound onto the brick of the path between the staging. She heard it without quite tracking it. Another drop fell a moment later, somewhere along the staging on the right. The condensation on the glass had been gathering all afternoon, and the drops were beginning their release, the ordinary weather of an evening greenhouse in deep winter. A long time passed in this way. The light beyond the glass eased lower. The blues in the sky beyond the panes went toward indigo. Where the snow lay thinner on the roof, a single early star showed for a moment in a clear patch of sky, and then a thin drift of cloud crossed it, and the star was gone again. Wren had stopped paying close attention to the world beyond the glass. The world inside the glass had grown all around her, and her body had settled into the chair, and her hands had grown heavy around the cup, and her shoulders had given themselves up entirely to the curved back of the old kitchen chair. She set the empty cup back on the staging beside the thermos. She let her hands fall to her lap. They settled there, palms up, fingers slightly curled. She let her head rest a little against the curve of the chair's back. The wall of her cap pressed against the wood. Her eyes, which had been wide with the careful seeing of the evening's work, began to settle. The wood stove ticked. The cyclamen held their pink. The lamps held their yellow circles. The snow on the roof held its weight. She drifted, just a little, not far. The kind of drifting that happens to a body that has been doing careful work in a heated room and has been allowed at last to stop. She let her eyes close fully. The amber dark behind her eyelids was a dark with heat at its edges, the lamp's light soaking through into the dark behind her seeing. She listened. The wood stove tick, the faint hush of combustion, the almost not a sound of the damp air settling around the leaves of the cyclamen and the pelargoniums, the cool weight of the snow on the glass roof holding above her. A leaf shifted somewhere on the staging. One of the cyclamen, perhaps, settling a fraction in its pot in the way that cyclamen settle through an evening. She heard it without quite hearing it. The greenhouse was full of these unimportant releases at this hour, each one a separate movement, all of them together the sound of a room of plants going on with their lives. None of them needed her to listen. But she listened anyway, in the way one listens to the breathing of a person asleep beside one, just to know that the breathing is going on as it should. Her body had grown heavy in the chair. The chair held her. The greenhouse held the chair. The garden held the greenhouse. The snow held the garden. Each ring of holding folded into the next, like a careful set of nesting bowls, and at the center of all the bowls, in the green hold of the greenhouse evening, was Wren in her old kitchen chair, with her cup empty on the staging beside her, and her hands at rest in her lap. She breathed in. The damp green air came in. She breathed out. The breath went out into the same air and was taken back into the hold of the room. The wood stove ticked. The cyclamen held their pink. The lamps held their circles. A long time passed. The lamps burned a little lower without going out. The wood stove burned its careful burn. The snow on the roof did not move. Wren did not move either. The chair held her. She was held. She drifted further. The amber dark went farther. The sounds of the greenhouse's evening kept their company. The wood stove ticked. The lamps glowed. The plants stood in their rows. She breathed in. She breathed out. The greenhouse held her. The light beyond the glass had gone fully to evening. The snow on the roof lay where it lay. The lamps in the greenhouse held their careful heat. The chair held her shoulders. The cap held her head. The greenhouse held everything. She slept in her chair beside the wood stove in the green hold of the greenhouse, while the snow lay on the glass above her and the winter evening kept its careful watch over the sleeping garden beyond. She slept.